Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Today we're talking with longtime Law and Liberty contributor Graham McAleer about the natural law. He's the author of a new book called Eric Chavara and Postmodern Natural Law. We'll talk about who that thinker is, and also postmodern natural law in this discussion. Graham has contributed dozens of pieces to Law and Liberty over the past few years on fashion, the ethics of fashion. He's written on burkinis. He's written on offshore trusts and family values, the Scottish Enlightenment. He's explored the nature of classical liberalism and defended it on the side, and has also written on numerous thinkers that you wouldn't necessarily think could be conservative or have a classical liberal connection, like Lacan, but Graham's done it, and he's done it very well. Glad to have you first time on Liberty Law Talk. How are you today?
Great. Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much.
So, and our listeners, I know many of them have thought about and read about natural law. You've, in the title, as I said, Eric Chavara and Postmodern Natural Law. What is postmodern natural law?
Well, if we begin with postmodern, so postmodernism more or less grows up in the 1960s. It's incubating before that, but it's a reaction to the failings. It's very much a European, originally a European movement reacting to the failings of European ideas, obviously, not only with the Nazis, but with the communists. So it's a sense, so many people, left and right, have the sense, right, that not all is well with the world, not all is well with modernity, and most glaringly, the promise of the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment was supposed to make us more calmer, more generous, more thoughtful, but the 20th century was a certain kind of repudiation of that idea. So postmodernism begins more or less in the 60s. There's a whole bunch of thinkers, especially in France, and they're trying to work out sort of what went wrong and what the future might look like. But at the same time, they're not nostalgic. They're not believers. They don't want to go back to the Middle Ages. They're not Christians. So they want, without a kind of a return to God, they want to try to find what is sort of still good about the human being after the atrocities of the 20th century. So postmodernism, it's a whole bunch of different thinkers. It sometimes gets very complex, sometimes they're very interested in psychoanalysis, sometimes interested in the nature of language, but it all sort of boils down to an effort to try to think about how to have good communities, good politics in the light of what happened in the 20th century. So,
but now postmodern natural law, because is an interesting idea. I think of another close friend of mine who passed away, Peter Lawler, in 2017, who had this idea of postmodern conservatism, or, and something that I had a lot of, or still have affinity for that idea, the POMO-con idea. And Peter's idea was that postmodernism signaled the end of the modern world, and all of its aspirations and hopes of making us at home within the world, and that its techniques and concepts had failed, as you've sort of articulated, and that conservatism, or the ability to look back to the full breadth of the humanistic tradition, including religion, in the West, was needed. So your idea of postmodern natural law, I guess let's talk about how does that alter natural law, and maybe we need just a baseline. I mean, natural law itself is very complex and rich, but maybe talk more about that.
Yeah, sure. So natural law, it's primarily associated with St. Thomas Aquinas in the High Middle Ages. He died around 1274, so sort of taught primarily in Paris, and so it's a kind of a culmination. It's been a long time gestating, but it was a culminating in the sort of High Middle Ages. And the idea of natural law is that the law is, in its rudiments, political. So it was an effort not to get caught up in national passions. Now, from Thomas Aquinas, you can see, of course, he's a priest, he's a monk, he's, of course, favors the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church, of course, was always in a struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor, with national kings. You know, it was all about power, assertions of power. So natural law came to be this sort of idea about how to think about the law in isolation, simply from national passions. And then later on, the natural law became very important with the Age of Discovery. When the Europeans started to move out into the world, they encountered radically different kinds of lifestyles, politics, and this really sent sort of shockwaves, right? So then it became natural law was a kind of a way to have a sort of a communication amongst very different people when important things were at stake, not only things like property, but things like human sacrifice. So natural law is an effort to think about what is it that humans are obligated to living in common, but also to try to generate a great deal of flexibility to take seriously the idea of different geographical, cultural, historical dispositions. My own idea of the postmodern, and a little bit maybe like Lawler, was to then try to think about, well, how to sort of update an idea that when most people think of natural law, they think of something very medieval, very kind of old-fashioned. They think of it as very constraining. They think of it as very, to use a word from this guy Shabara that I'm interested in, very univocal. That is like one size fits all. And that's often the worry in the sort of modern legal academy with natural law, is it appears to be extremely dogmatic and sort of tending towards some sort of tyranny. But there's a way, I think, to think about natural law. So natural law concerns our basic appetites, and it sort of posits this idea. So Aquinas says there are four things basically going on with humans. We want to preserve our existence. We want to continue in existence. We want to have family. We want to enjoy society. And then there is also the problem of God, that there are no civilizations that haven't sort of grown up in and around the problem of God, the afterlife. If you even look at the most early human burial sites that we have dating back 35, 40,000 years ago, these people are buried with grave goods, with beautiful ornamented spears, necklaces. So there's something weird about us, says Aquinas, right? That there's always this problem of God that has to be confronted. So those are the basic sort of dynamics of the human being, and those need to be articulated in law, and they are. If you just think about what is it that legislatures kind of dwell on, well, they dwell on problems of self-care, how to raise children, how to protect children, what are the conditions for good human community, how to avoid hatred, and of course, but maybe more controversially, right, the problem of God is always, do you exclude God? Do you include God? How do you keep God contained in some way, or do you become a kind of like a theocratic Iran? So Aquinas, I think, is quite astute when he thinks about what is it that politics is about, and it appears to revolve around these four basic dynamics.
Now you say
that's the natural law.
Let me ask you this question, because you said we want to preserve our existence, and I'm trying, and you said that, and I'm thinking about the modern West. And last time I read, I don't know, is there any country in what we would think of as the modern West that even has a reproduction birth rate above or even with a stable what's called a stable population rate, rather than a declining or an increasing population rate? I don't think there is.
Yeah. So
what do you make of that? And I guess I asked that. I want your answer on that, because you say in the first chapter, or the introduction, that natural law can remedy our failing humanism. Is that evidence of a failing humanism that we need to remedy?
Yes. I mean, as you probably know, right, there are certain European states, right, which are offering sort of tax incentives to have children. France famously is doing this because of, right, so there's a kind of a utility argument, right, which is, well, if you don't have if you're not replicating, you can't actually have a good dynamic economy. And so you see, right, so one sort of argument about why Japan is so advanced on robotics is that they have one of the worst birth rates in on the planet. And indeed, right, there are these kind of, and I'm no expert on Japan, right, but you see these reports, right, where there's huge numbers of young adults who have never even been on a date with somebody of the opposite sex, right? There seems to be this kind of weird, almost death spiral fascination, that's going on. So, but natural law would say, well, look, right, the law here can be a remedy, right? So if the law sort of insists that you do need to sort of replicate, and even sort of Darwinism, right, would be sort of making this argument, then actually you can do things around the nature of law that's going to encourage it. Because, of course, can nations go off the boil, so to speak, right? Can they depart? This was kind of what happened with the Age of Discovery, right? The Europeans go out and they discover cultures which seem so very different, so seemingly strange. And so the idea was to try to find, well, are there these underlying dynamics that can one correct? Could one correct a culture? Could one correct a civilization? So actually, it's very interesting to look at people like Francisco de Vitoria, who was a Thomist around the 1500s. He was the first person to articulate the idea of regime change on the basis of natural law. He said you could meet a population that was so departed from natural law that for their own good, you could actually change their rulers. And this actually is an argument that he had for the Spanish defeating the Aztecs. Now, of course, there's all sorts of controversies and historical problems with that. But the idea that nations can go off the rails, well, we know that, right? Because we know this is what happened also in the 20th century. So natural law in this case then would be a kind of an educational model in some sense, right? A way to help us get back to what is the sort of the highest good of a human being.
Thinking about this failing humanism problem, is the failing humanism that we don't actually take ourselves seriously as embodied creatures or take nature seriously? You have an interesting discussion about metaphysics and decapitation. And it makes me wonder, is it the case that late modern man, or postmodern man, or however you want to characterize this, that we don't in fact take nature seriously? I mean, we're all about the environment and nature and all that, I understand, but that we don't think through the complexity of who we are as human beings. Because I think you think we're kind of lost in that regard, and maybe that's a reason why we have birth rates of 1.2, et cetera, and are as Pierre Manat would say, post-familial, post-religious, and post-political.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say, right, that and this I do get from this Jesuit theologian, Eric Chavara, right, we oscillate between thinking of ourselves as mere bodies and at other times as angels. So it's extremely common, right? In fact, one even might say, right, a sort of a standard person, right, deeply interested in environmentalism, is also somebody who wants a sort of a radical assertion of their own autonomy. So on the one hand, right, the very same person who's deeply interested in environmental stewardship might also be a big, big fan, right, of transgenderism, right, which seems to be a sort of a contradiction, right, that a deep respect for the nature that we are gifted with versus then a sort of a radical assertion of autonomy and technological transformation. So this would be what I call decapitation, right? Sometimes we think of ourselves as angels.
Would another instance of that be, the same people will tell you, I'm an autonomous individual, natural rights, or I have so many rights everywhere, but I'm also I'm fully explainable by evolution. I'm a materialistic, being. That's who I am. Animal, clever animal. That's it. But not really thinking through, well, how does that all work?
Sure. No, and that's the other side of it, right? So, you hear all the time, people will say that that you shouldn't go around repressing. What's the problem with morality? What's the problem with moral earnestness? Well, it's just a repression of these sort of powerful desires that you had better let release. Otherwise, you'll become sort of perverted and twisted, right? So it's a kind of a classic argument against like the Catholic priesthood, right? That it's sort of ignoring this sort of radical vitalism. So sometimes we're these sort of angel beings, and sometimes we're these thoroughly materialistic beings. And that's this kind of, and the weird thing is, says Shavara, is that we flip rapidly between the two, right? So we're not consistently one or the other, right? And this then leads to this idea of sort of mistaking sort of what's in the middle, this idea that we are bodies that can be articulated through civilizational values.
So the body is, I guess maybe help us understand the unifying aspect there. That would sort of, help us make sense of this wild metaphysics. What do we need to, how should we approach that?
Right. Well, so in a classical Aristotelian ethics, right, you have your desires and you need the virtues. You need the virtues to perfect your desires. So, for example, the problem of fear. Fear is natural enough, but there's a right time to be fearful and there's a wrong time to be fearful. And you can overly compensate by becoming reckless. This is highly dangerous, both to yourself and to the people around you. Or, of course, you can sort of undercook it, right? And you can indeed exhibit a kind of a cowardice when in fact you need to be strong for others. This is, for example, very frequent, we found, right, in the problem of parenting, right? Sometimes you have to be the strong one to say to the family, to a child, look, this just is not okay. This is going to be damaging, right? But a lot of parents, obviously, and especially in a kind of a more liberal society, right, can often evade those responsibilities. So we have this idea inherited at least from Aristotle and also found in natural law that we need a rational, virtuous articulation of our appetites and our bodily inclinations. So inclinations for food, safety, security, etc. And you'll often find, right, so in the book, I talk about the strange idea that you find with our relationship to the embryo, right? So on the one hand, the embryo is seen as a source of great medical potential. But on the other hand, right, it's seen as something that we can be completely cavalier about, right? So we have this kind of weird schizophrenic relationship, right, to early life. Sometimes it's the most valuable thing in the world, right? So you think about all the parties celebrating a pregnancy, and sometimes it's the thing most casually cast off and put into laboratories and spliced and diced. So sometimes, right, the baby is sort of angelic, and sometimes it's a kind of resource. And that's even the way that people often think about their own children, right? The way that you think about the way that sometimes parents will foster a certain kind of attitude in their children, which is demanding of them, just far too much, right? So these are these sort of, we kind of ricochet between these two options of what Shavara calls vitalism on the one hand, connected with the body, and angelism connected with the mind. But what you need to do is somehow try to hold the two in tension.
On that point, on that analogy point, you have this idea, liturgy of morals in value tones as well. And I want to talk about that through this great example you give, which I think our listeners will enjoy, of James Bond. How does James Bond help us understand those concepts and sort of explicate for us postmodern natural law?
Yeah, so Bond, I think, is an interesting phenomenon, right? So on the one hand, it is a huge marketing, economic business. And if we think a little bit about, well, what is James Bond? Well, he's a kind of powerful human physique wedded to very strong sense of justice, care of the other. Of course, this is then fed through ideas of the British establishment, right? He is sort of for Queen and country. But this is sort of the thing that I was interested in, was trying to find examples where the body is linked to establishment, where the body is linked to civilizational values. And you see this, right? You see this with the way that Bond dresses, his interest in clothes, his interest in sports, his interest in cars, and of course his interest in games. And so one of the ideas that I had was to try to think about how the natural law is linked to games and the liturgies in games, right? So there is so on the one hand, right, you hear people say, look, relativism, cultural relativism goes all the way down. Humans are just radically different from one another by history and by civilization. But this isn't quite true, right? Because one of the assured things, you go anywhere in the world and you throw a ball and humans will run after it. All cultures, bizarrely, have games connected with humans running after a ball. What's going on there?
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting about that, actually, is that not only do we run after balls, but we generate rituals and we generate rules and we generate referees and umpires to navigate the rules and to determine when something was out of bounds, when someone stepped over the line. So what you see, actually, is that our moral vocabulary is linked profoundly to the idea of playing games, the idea of a playing field. And you can look at all manner of establishment venues and to see this idea, right? So you've got various rules of etiquette at the law court, parliament, and so on. So I was interested in Bond as a figure of someone who is very playful, but who serves the establishment, who serves justice, who serves law. And then to think a little bit about, well, what were the values that he was literally bringing to bear? And these have something to do with fashion, style, glamour. And this is why I've always been interested in the Scottish Enlightenment and Adam Smith and the idea of economics as driven by luxury. And it seems to me, again, not only do humans immediately run after a ball, no matter where they are in the world, actually, what we've learned over the last 200 years, at least, is that we also run after luxury.
Expensive, shiny objects. We like that.
Yeah, right. So what Adam Smith calls toys of frivolous utility. Actually, the utility goes quite far down, but his point was that our interest in luxury is not primarily about utility. It's about the playfulness. It's about the ritual. It's about the ritual of, you see this all the time on the internet, right? So if somebody's interested in Louis Vuitton bags, right, there are all these videos, right, especially of women, but not just women, unpacking the box, the Louis Vuitton box that came in the post. And these boxes, they're orange, and you open up the box, and inside they're in a kind of a cloth envelope, and you open up the envelope, and then you open up the bag, and you show what's in the bag, right? These rituals around things that are beautiful. What's going on about those videos is, right, these YouTube videos is, they get millions of views. So what's going on there, right? Something profound about our nature is going on.
Help us understand, though, this idea, liturgy of morals have to be a liturgy. You guard the book. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, so there's a lot of moral theories that are very either mathematical or extremely austere. Right, so a very mathematical moral theory is, of course, utilitarianism, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, right? It even sounds like a mathematical proposition. Another very popular one is Kantianism, and Kant says that you and I must obey the moral law, and we can only obey the moral law if we are extremely pure, if it is purely the moral law that determines our action and not our culture, not our historical condition, not our private appetite, not privileging certain people. You must sort of obey the austerity of the law. So you have these extremely abstract, almost mathematical, purity kind of moral laws. But there's another way to think about ethics, which is, I think, through liturgy, I say liturgy, I mean it quite broadly. I mean the kinds of liturgies that you see at sports games.
Okay.
Right? So sports games, right? People dress up in the colors of their team. They go to a particular playing field. Some of these playing fields are very sort of sacred, right? There are even playing fields in England around soccer teams where one can be buried under the grass, right? So it becomes sort of a burial ground, right? And you sing songs. There are collective gestures. When your side scores a goal, you act one way. When you miss the goal, you act another way. So you have these gestures. And it seems to me that our ethics can actually be built around these rituals rather than these more abstract principles of purity.
So what we need is more institutions. We just had Yuval Levin on the show. That's his whole book. We need to rebuild our institution. We need more institutions. We need more forms, procedures, things like. Does modern? It seems like so. Democratic society, from one view, tears these things down because we want to be liberated from them. We want to be. I got to be me, is the cry. But you're calling for. We actually need something like the rules of a courtroom. We need, or of a parliament, or even a workplace. In a way, a workplace has a lot of written and unwritten rules of how you should conduct yourself. We need those. Is that what you're saying to act moral?
Yeah, I think what we need are, so on the one hand, right, you're absolutely correct, right? There is a certain movement today that we need to sort of get rid of our institutions. Now, of course, then there's another movement, right, which is, well, no, we need more of them, right? So we need to go between the two poles, right? This would be what Eric Shavara calls the analogical position.
Okay.
You need the rituals. These rituals are publicly enacted. But again, to go back to sports, right, the point about sports would be that these sports associations are what sort of Burke would call, right, these sort of middle institutions, right, where people gather. They gather under their own terms, through their own proclivities, through their own interests, and we don't need them micromanaged by the state, right? Humans are quite clever at coming together in association that is not only sort of healthy in a way, right? But actually it enacts rules, right? So the rules of the golf club, the rules of the tennis court, all of these rules make us more law-abiding, right? They are, so in other words, right, one of the things I wanted to argue was that rule of law is actually embedded in our play structures, in our rituals of games.
Okay. So here, another thing, related question, I think, natural law and value tones. Talk about that some, because that's also an interesting idea.
Yeah, so in the 20th century, but I think even you can find this in Adam Smith, actually, but in the 20th century, you had what was called value theory. It began in Germany. It is linked to a philosopher I know you yourself quite like, Aurel Colnay.
Okay, yeah.
And value theory is the idea that there are categories of values, and we are extremely alert to them. These values come in a hierarchy. So you have values of utility, right? So we have a cell phone because it enables us to be in communication with the world. So it has utility. There are values of vitality, physical exercise. There are, and to keep with the cell phone idea, right? We also show vitality in the pictures that we share. and videos that we watch. So something like the app TikTok is a good example of this vitality in connect with a cell phone. Then there are intellectual and scientific values, which of course are linked also to questions of design. You find this in the iPhone. And then there are values of the person and the divine. The idea of that at the top of the value hierarchy is a fundamental regard for personhood. And this, again, it seems to me, right, is the idea, right, where people think of their cell phones, and especially young people, students that I teach, think of their cell phones as an extension of their personhood. So there is a hierarchy of values, and there are thousands of values contained in each and every one of these categories, right? So let's just take an example. Perfume. So there's a vast industry, Chanel 5, right? There's a vast industry connected with perfume. Well, what is a perfume? Well, it's a set of value tones. It's a set of distinct scents, right? So somebody could walk up to someone who was wearing a certain kind of a perfume and say, oh, I really love the citrus scent in that perfume. What is it, please? Can you tell me about that? Right? So you and I actually are extremely good at understanding these value tones. And at every level, right? We're very good at picking up on what's useful. We're very good at picking up on what is sort of vital, like things that smell good, things that smell bad. We're very good at picking up on design and sort of scientific ideas. And then, of course, right, what we hope, of course, this is a hard one in some sense, right? But we hope we're also very good at affirming human personhood. So this idea of value ethics became very dominant in the 20th century, and it was seen as a corrective of the sort of mathematization of ethics that you found in utilitarianism, which is linked to Jeremy Bentham in England in the late 18th century, and with Kantianism in the 19th century. And so what I wanted to do was then try to link what I saw in Thomas Aquinas about these basic inclinations and value theory, and my linkage was really to kind of dwell on this idea of games and plays and rituals, because I think, again, right, we see these value tones in the various kinds of games, the way that we dress up for them, the songs that we sing, etc.
Thinking here, I mean, when you see, most people would respond to that and think, well, this is consumerism. It's just a love of stuff. I mean, a lot of what I think about the fashion or a lot of things that people purchase in the sports itself, sort of, this is like your fascination with sports is some substitute for something you should be doing. But it's, that idea. How does that
Well, I think consumerism, so the critique of consumerism, which one hears all the time, obviously, with Pope Francis in particular these days, one hears it. But actually, if you think about what's going on, right, in the purchase of, say, a Louis Vuitton bag, actually what there is a deference to the values of craft, the values of inheritance, the values of long tuition, learning how to build something from these materials in a way that is beautiful, supple, also useful. So it seems to me that consumerism, one can look at consumerism rather superficially, but there is, I think, a fascination with these objects of high design. There is, in fact, a deference to these value tones, that we all understand what's fascinating about a Lamborghini car, right? Well, what's fascinating about that is its industrial complexity. Okay. And this is then something that does, in fact, right? So consumerism would be the idea, look, this makes people completely superficial. This is all about the pleasures. But in fact, it really isn't. If I may, let me give an example I love from Shaftesbury, who was one of the sort of founding, an Englishman, but he was very important to the Scottish Enlightenment. Shaftesbury gives this example of a man who has a hawk to go hunting with. But the man over time sort of falls in love with the hawk, and he puts the hawk on a pedestal and he feeds the hawk and he just sits looking at the hawk. It's so beautiful. Well, we sort of do this, right, in the way in which those of us who are fascinated by collections, whether collections of handbags or cars, pipes, right, there is a certain kind of value world that imposes itself upon us and helps actually make us better, right? So people who love, just keep going on about a Louis Vuitton bag, right? They also look after it, right? Yeah. They cherish it in certain ways. and they follow certain rules about how to care for it. So this is also a bit like the sports idea as well, right? That we actually do learn about ideas of fair play, not breaking the rules. Although we also, right, and I point this out in the book, right, we also have ways that people can play tricks in games, but there are penalties. And one accepts the penalty, right? And so we see this both deference to these values, which sort of impose themselves upon us, right? These things that are higher than us, they're structuring us, which is very much like the natural law. And it also teaches about ethics and morality.
So maybe the signal that you're overindulging would be you're running up a high debt to buy all these items. Maybe that's a signal. Maybe would that be part of the liturgy of morals?
The overindulging part, you mean?
Yeah, if you were, so what would be the sign that you're overindulging? It would be debt, consumer debt. You're racking up consumer debt. Maybe that's part of the liturgy of morals here.
Yeah, well, no, certainly, right. There can be, right. This is how also fakes exist, right? Because, right, certain people know people have these desires, and even though they're not in a position to actually purchase the real thing, they'll purchase the cheaper version, and so abuse, but it's true of all ethics, right? All ethics has to deal with certain excesses. So and I'll do grant, right, that, I mean, you can have bad games, right? I think even you see this in James Bond movies, right? That the baddies play certain kind of bad games, and Bond has to play the game and somehow find a way to reassert the decency and the goodness in the doing of the game. So yeah, I mean that obviously there is something there, but I still think that game structures are a useful way to think about how to structure our appetites towards community, towards ideas of fair play.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. Again, it's interesting too, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about the liturgy of morals and the value tones. Before we got online, or we got into this discussion, you and I were talking about the recent British election, where the Conservatives scored a resounding victory that no one predicted. And I'm thinking, is this part of it? The British public grew tired of watching the rules sort of being flouted, or if not interpreted in weird ways to sort of privilege one side. I think in particular of the Speaker of the House, John Bercow, I'm forgetting his formal title. That would be the American title, but
right,
who seemed to be
Speaker of the House,
who seemed to be putting his thumb on the rules, and sort of the way in which the debate was flowing or not flowing, and people grew tired of it. People wanted the rules.
Yeah,
I wonder.
Yeah. So I'm right. So I mean, I think probably what's happening over in England over the last few years, right, is a conflict of two different kinds of games. There's the games played in Parliament, and of course, right, this is, as you know, right, a Prime Minister's question time, right? The idea is to turn the opposition into the pantomime villain, and everyone's jeering and laughing, right? There's an extremely strong play structure built inside the procedures of Parliament and Congress. But there'd been another game that had been played, the game of a democratic election. This is also a game. Gamesmanship is part of it, right? So this is a bit when the politician takes off his or her jacket, rolls up the sleeves, and starts holding the babies and kissing the babies, right? There's a kind of a playfulness in what it means to go on the hustings and to speak in public, and the rituals of rhetoric that go with that. And so that game, right, which was somehow perceived in England as a kind of, the election was a kind of a more primordial game in a way, right, where the whole people had come together and had played a game, the election. And then there was this sense, well, there's this other kind of a game going on, and this other kind of a game seems to want to subvert this more primordial game that we all just engaged in. And I think what happened, right, I mean, I think one way to explain the astonishing result that happened just before Christmas was that there was a kind of a deep sensibility in England that the original game that had been played, the election, was the one that absolutely must be respected. And so you had people who were wanting to stay in the European Union who nonetheless voted Conservative because they felt, look, we had an election and that needs to be and Parliament is sort of playing around, but in a negative sense, right? So there's a negative sense of playing around, right? They're playing me for a fool. And so it seems to me there was a kind of a conflict of two different kinds of games, two different kinds of rituals that had to be resolved there.
Yeah. No, things were so bad. It was in the press that the Queen was sort of astonished at the dysfunctionality of the British political class, which I assume I assumed that someone wanted that to come out, which is interesting. Just sort of underscoring that the rules not being followed or understood. And also, the Liturgy of Morals helps us understand how Republican government has to work. I think I want to end the discussion thinking about law specifically. You say in the introduction that two conceptions of law are both wrong. One of which is the conception of law in Islam, but then also more familiar to us in the Enlightenment understanding of law, that it's just, so the Islamic law would be it's purely divine will, and that's what we're recording. The Enlightenment perspective, it's just human will. It's just, we understand it. We can run out its content through human rationality. Talk about why you think, under your conception of natural law, those are both equally wrong in different ways.
Yeah, so in the Islamic conception, right, the law comes directly from God, and so the ways that humans over the centuries have organized themselves, their customs, their rituals, their games, their forms of worship, the clothes that they wear, right? All of these things have to be put through a kind of a grinder, the grinder of divine law. And so, right, you see this in the most extreme version, of course. This is an extreme version. I'm not saying this is what Islam is, but an extreme version of ISIS, right, when they engage in this sort of radical cultural destruction, right, that nothing even of the past may interfere with the sort of deference to the demands of the law of God. But then on the flip side, in the European Enlightenment American side, right, we have this idea that the law should just reflect whatever our current passions are. So this idea of the evolving constitution, or even Joe Biden had this idea of the evolving natural law, right? But this idea that our national passions, nothing may stand in the way of those. And this is a kind of a presentism, right? This is about our national passions today. Who we are today will determine the kind of law we have tomorrow. And natural law sets its face against that, right? So against Islam, natural law says, look, we have all these customary ways that have arisen out of the way that we deal with our basic inclinations. These need to be respected. And in the sort of Christian tradition of natural law, they are respected, right? Divine law is a very particular, finite part of what actually the law is. There's also human law connected with institutions and judiciaries, and then there's the natural law, the basic inclinations. But the kind of Enlightenment idea, right, that the people of today are more enlightened than the people of yesterday, and therefore we don't need to respect the legacies of the nation. And this takes us then to a thinker like Edmund Burke, who thought that the establishment that we had inherited was to be preserved precisely because it picked up on an important idea that humans are an historical people, right? We have our heritage and we will also have a future. So you need reform, but you also have a legacy, and this legacy also had deep abiding value. So natural law is wanting to sort of insist that there is a kind of abiding center of moral orientation, but it also wants to be flexible and supple to take on changes, obviously changes in technology, changes in economic order. But the Enlightenment sort of gets that wrong as well, right? Because it's far too voluntaristic. It thinks of, we should just think about what was so bad about communism. Well, communism was a sort of an idea, a kind of a geometrics of human control in which economic planning would determine the wholesale movement of entire peoples, right? So a certain
think what a particular application of your idea in the Enlightenment would be the I mean, and I don't think he's nearly as dominant as he once was in the academy, but John Rawls' idea, which is clearly in the American Legal Academy, that law and the reasons for law must be, purely secular, and have this sort of ability to build overlapping consensus, which is the insistence on public reasons, secular reasons for law. And your conception of natural law would say to him that's you're simplifying law to a great degree, and not admitting that there's a ground for law. I think that's not just reason, or am I wrong?
No, that's right. I mean, towards the end of the book, I talk about Rawls, right? And Rawls has this, as perhaps some people listening know, right? He's got this very, very cool and strange and interesting thought experiment, right? This where you go behind this veil, and he says, you have to sort of strip yourself down. Essentially, he doesn't say this, right? But you have to almost think of yourself as an angel, a being without a body, and you go behind this veil, and with no interest, right. You're just this sort of atom. With no deep inclinations at all, no preferences at all. And you then kind of work out, well, once I come from behind the veil and I enter the world, what do I want the world to look like, right? What do I need the world to be? And so so I think a natural law theorist would think that Rawls' starting point is extremely strange. Now, you see its heritage, of course, in Kant, and the idea of this kind of approach of purity to the law. But of course, we're not pure in that sense, right? We come with inclinations, right? This is the deep insight of natural law. We come with a set of inclinations, and we need to work on those inclinations. And so the sort of the Rawlsian idea that we could remake ourselves, I think, is based upon what Shavara would call an angelism. We can't totally remake ourselves, right? Because we can't ignore the fact that we are these very complex animals with a past, right? With our kind of genetic inheritance, but also, right? We, for whatever reason, and as we even see in the earliest burial sites, we have this idea of some sort of afterlife, some sort of continuity beyond this world.
Yeah,
that then raises. What Pierre Manon calls, right, the theological political problem, right? The problem of the divine, right, is going to have to be resolved somehow inside of politics. So again, it seems to me this is what Rawls completely ignores, right? Because he does want things so secular, right? He's sort of tied to this idea that the religious is always inherently destabilizing, violent. I mean, I think he's got a pretty kind of a caricature of what the development of religions has been like. So it seems to me natural law is a really useful way to take seriously what it means to be a human animal and the fundamental appetites that kind of repeat in all cultures. And again, I took the idea of games and values as a way to see that we do seemingly, no matter where we are in a civilization, we do seem to want to play certain kinds of games, and we do seemingly want to buy certain kind of products and these engage, I think, these fundamental values and inclinations.
Graham McAleer, I think that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much for discussing your book, Eric Shavara and Postmodern Natural Law. It's been great. This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.